Kia ora. Thank you so much for inviting me here. I'm actually very moved to be here as part of this incredible national conversation that you're having. Thank you to the people of this place for inviting me to this incredible area of Taranaki. Thank you to the government for welcoming me in on this conversation, because you're having one of the toughest, most important conversations of our times. The reason I'm here, because it's a long way to come, is because what you're doing here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, is leading the world. And I'm so impressed and inspired and want to take so many of the ideas that you're putting into practice now back into the economics that we write for the 21st century. So the reason I'm talking about economics is because I was a student of economics, and I became deeply frustrated with what I was taught. And I want to share with you some of the economics that I think underlies the world we have come from, because we now need to rewrite it for the 21st century. So the conversations that are happening in parliaments around the world, in boardrooms, in the media, they're shaped by an economic mindset from last century. And they are holding us back because we need new ideas that are fit for our times. And you may never have studied economics, but the ideas that happen and that come out of economics departments shape the conversations that we all have. Let me just ask a quick show of hands. Put your hand up if you've ever studied economics in any form. Okay. Wow, there's a lot of people in the room. But whether you have or not, these ideas shape how we think. Sometimes economists get upset with me and they say, your old critique. And I say, well, look, show me the first diagram in economics that you ever teach. What's the first diagram that you ever learn? Oh, you know it already. Supply and demand, right? There we are. The crisscross of supply and demand. Putting price and the market at the center of our thinking from day one. What about the portrait of humanity that was shown? It's rational economic man. Well, he never actually gets drawn, so I decided to give him a portrait. He'd have to be a man, standing alone, with money in his hand, ego in his heart, a calculator in his head, and nature at his feet. He hates work, he loves luxury, and he knows the price of everything. The trouble with this character is that the more that students learn about him, the more they come to actually believe that self-interest and competition are the most important traits, not collaboration and cooperation. And then the real problem with economics is the underlying narratives of the motion and progress that we would make. Economics modeled itself on Newtonian physics, and Newton made himself famous forever because he discovered the physical laws of motion. And I think economists set out to try and find the economic laws of motion. The first was the idea from the 1950s that if you care about inequality, don't try to redistribute, because growth would gradually, things may get more unequal, but then things would even up again. And this Kuznets curve underpinned austerity policy, trickle-down economics for generations. It's not true, and we need to leave it in the past. If you care about pollution and the living world, don't try to regulate and get in the way, because growth, like a well-trained child, will apparently clean up after itself. Except it doesn't. But the grow now, clean up later economics had such traction for so long, and we need to leave it in the past. And these underpinned perhaps the strongest story, that the growth of GDP must, will, and has been always endless, and that this is how we should judge our economic progress. I think we need to leave these ideas in the past because we know so much more, and we need to begin again with a 21st century economics that's fit for our times. So I want to offer you the only donut that actually turns out to be good for us. The good news is you don't have to eat it. It's just an idea. Let me explain to you what's going on here, because I want to put this as the new purpose for 21st century economics. Imagine humanity's use of resources radiating out from the middle of that picture. So the hole in the middle is the place where people are left falling short on the essentials of life, without the food and water, healthcare, education, community support, the networks, political voice that every person has a claim to. I crowdsource these from the world's governments, so they are the social priorities set out in the Sustainable Development Goals. That means the world's governments have already agreed that every person in the world has a claim to meeting every one of these needs. Let's leave nobody behind in that hole in the middle. Get everybody over the social foundation. But, it's a big but, we cannot allow our use of Earth's resources to overshoot the outer edge, because there we put so much pressure on this extraordinary, delicately balanced living planet that we begin to kick our planet out of balance. And we cause climate breakdown. We acidify the oceans. We create a hole in the ozone layer. These 9 dimensions around the outside are known as the 9 planetary boundaries. Earth system scientists believe they are the life-supporting systems that make this beautiful planet such a benevolent home for humanity. So put those 2 together, and the aim is to meet the needs of all people within the means of the planet. And I offer that as one kind of compass for 21st century progress. The aim is not ever rising growth. The aim is to find balance, to rediscover, as we know in our bodies, our health lies in balance. Let's find that relationship in relation to the planet, human and planetary balance. But if this is the compass, you want to know where we are. And that's not an easy picture to look at, because all of the red in this picture shows us the extent to which we're falling short or overshooting on the planet. If you look in the middle up here, ooh, can I do this? No, that's not doing it. Food near the top goes 11% of the way towards the center of the circle, that red wedge, because 11% of people worldwide don't have enough food to eat every day. We want to eliminate that red wedge and all of the red in the center of the circle, so no one is left falling short. But you can see millions or billions of people worldwide still can't meet their most basic needs. But we've already overshot at least 4 of these planetary boundaries: on climate change, on biodiversity loss and ecosystem collapse, on land conversion, excessive use of nitrates and phosphates in fertilizer that doesn't get taken up by plants but leaches out into waterways and kills them off. If the graph doesn't bring it home, let me bring it home in some headlines. The UN tells us we've got a decade in which to halve our global carbon emissions if we want to stay below 1.5 degrees. WWF told us that since 1970, that's the year I was born. I'll save you the maths, I'm 48. Since 1970, the populations of all other animals has fallen by 60%. We've got plastics pollution in human bodies the world over, air pollution, land degradation, water shortages, phosphorus and nitrogen pollution, ocean acidification not seen in 14 million years. And the richest 1% of people own half of the world's wealth. That's heavy stuff for the first thing in the morning. Let me bring you one piece of good news here. I love this headline from NASA. The hole in Earth's ozone layer finally closing up because humans did something about it. Because we can do something about all of this, because all of this is to do with the way we have related to the planet. In the words of the US writer William S. Burroughs, after taking one look at our planet, any visitor from outer space would say, "I want to see the manager." And we laugh and we wonder, who is the manager? Let me very quickly find out who you think the manager is. I'm going to pass my invisible laser over your heads. And as it passes over your head, I want you to shout out so loud the people on the other side of the room can hear. Who is the manager? Interesting, wonderful replies. Okay, so sometimes people think it's the governments and they look to the governments to sort things out. Researchers at Leeds University took the Doughnut concept and scaled it down for 150 countries. In this diagram, you want to fill the center of the circle in blue to meet the social threshold, which is a very low global threshold, without overshooting that green ring. So on the one side, we've got Sri Lanka, not overshooting its pressure on those planetary boundaries, but falling short on many people's needs. We've got China in the middle, falling short on people's needs, already overshooting planetary boundaries. And then, since we're here, I brought New Zealand, almost filling in that circle blue. There's a gap there on inequality, but massively overshooting planetary boundaries. If that feels hard, you're in plenty of company, because here's the 150 countries of the world. So we want to get to that sweet spot where the donut is, to meet all those social needs without overshooting those planetary boundaries. So it's in that top left-hand corner. But there's no country anywhere close. And to me, this tells us that we are all developing countries now. There is no country in the world that can sit back and say we're developed, because we all have to transform our economies now that we fully understand what our well-being depends upon. We've got countries like No, this clicker doesn't want to be my friend. Okay, in the bottom, sitting under the donut, the typical countries we used to call developing, India, Indonesia, much of sub-Saharan Africa, they need to take an unprecedented journey and rise up towards that donut without following the overshoot that those before them have done. This has never been done before. But then look up in that top right-hand corner. New Zealand's there, the UK, Europe, Canada, Australia, America, all of today's high-income countries are clustered up there. And likewise have to make an unprecedented journey, sustaining good standards of living for people while pulling back within planetary boundaries, and we've never done it before. And this is why the conversations that you're having here are pioneering and will lead others to follow what you do. We've also got clustered the emerging economies in that opposite corner, China, Mexico, Egypt, Iran. How can they likewise doubly meet people's needs for the first time and come back within planetary boundaries? To me, this is a new definition of human prosperity for our times. So what kind of economics would give us a chance of getting there? I start economics with this diagram, and I call it the embedded economy diagram. We recognize that our economies are constructs. We invented them, and they're embedded within the social world, within our values and our legal systems and our trust and our communities, embedded in the living world, drawing in Earth's materials and matter, spewing out waste and pollution. So we must ask from day one, how big can that through flow of pressure be before we begin to disrupt the very systems on which we depend? But inside the economy, look, we've got not just the market, that supply and demand, also the state. This became a 20th century ideological boxing match. Are you for free market, laissez-faire capitalism, or state-loving socialism? And in that we missed sight of the household where we all begin every day, the unpaid caring work of parents and guardians and partners and children. But also the commons, where we co-create things that we value, whether it's a garden on the corner of our block or Wikipedia on the World Wide Web, or indeed a roadmap for transforming Taranaki. And the commons is going to be so important this century. And if we're reimagining that, we must reimagine our roles. You see, when economics begins with the market, it tells us that who we are is either consumer or producer, creditor or debtor. But that's a very, very narrow casting of our role. When we bring in the state, we are citizen, public servant, voter and protester. In relation to the household, we're all a parent or guardian or relative or child. And in the commons, we are co-creators, sharers, repairers, and stewards. The 20th century celebrated self-interest in the market, and we must broaden to our full economic identities. And if there's one thing that we can do for the next generation to enable and to have the values and skills to be good householders and commoners and members of their state, don't teach your kids to play Monopoly. Monopoly teaches us to win by hoarding property and extracting rent until you are the only player left in the game. That is so 20th century. I advise you teach your kids, and indeed you learn yourself, to play Pandemic. It's a cooperative game, and it teaches you to win by collaborating with all to rid the world of disease so that everyone is left in the game. Isn't that the kind of thing we have going on for our times? So let's learn to collaborate. When I sit at the table and play Pandemic with my kids and my friends, we are not skilled at collaborating. And I ask myself, where was this skill in my education? When do we learn to cooperate and listen and share and collaborate? Because that is the skill of the century that we need. So how can we get into the donut? All of this red tells us we have a deeply degenerative world. We're running down the living planet on which we depend. And it's deeply divisive, with millions of people unable to meet their basic needs, while others are already overshooting pressure on the planet. Well, let's not turn to last century's theories, because growth won't even things up again on its own, and it won't clean things up again. Grow now, clean up later didn't work. We have to be more proactive. We have to design the economy that we want to create. And I believe we need to put two principles at the heart of 21st century economics: to be distributive and regenerative by design, and I'll tell you what I mean by those. This is the linear, degenerative 20th century economy. We take Earth's materials, we make them into stuff we want. We use it for a while, often only once, and we throw it away. And take, make, use is pushing us over planetary boundaries. This is what it looks like when we take again and again and again from Earth's sources. And this is what it looks like when we spew our waste again and again into Earth's sinks, into lakes and rivers full of plastic ocean, and electronic waste in the neighborhoods of the world's poorest people. And the students who were up here yesterday morning, I sincerely believe that their children will ask them, maybe in 30, 40 years' time, did that really happen? Did you know about it? Because when we look at it like this, it's shocking. And we know we have to turn this pattern around. We have to bend those arrows around so that resources aren't used up, they're used again and again. We create a circular, regenerative economy that runs on sunlight and renewable energies, in which waste from one process becomes food for the next. Let me give you an example of a couple of companies that are starting to do this. Houdini Sportswear, a Swedish company, all of the clothing they make is made either from wool and tencel, which are organic fibers. They put it in a compost bin. They brought some of the clothing back, put it in a compost bin, turned it into soil, grew vegetables on top, and served it to their customers. And they said, you're eating your former ski wear, to show the circularity of nature. But also they make clothes from recycled wool and polyester. They are committed, and they've done the world's first planetary boundary assessment of all of the fibers in their supply chain. They are absolutely facing 21st century design. And then Open Motors. If you buy a car from them, it will arrive like this, like a wardrobe from IKEA, so good luck. They say if you know what you're doing, you can put it together in less than an hour. But if you don't, you can take it to someone who does, because how to assemble this chassis is open source on the internet. So anybody can set up and become an assembler. And once the basic chassis is made, it can be customized into an urban streetcar. They began making these electric streetcars and then realized, why should we sell people a car? What we really need is mobility. So now they're focusing on self-driving AI cars. And these really need to be modular by design, that you can put together and take apart and put together and take apart, because they'll drive 24 hours a day. And so the weakest part will wear out quickly and needs to be replaceable. To me, this is the beginning of 21st century manufacturing. It's distributed. And I invite you to think 20, 30 years' time, what will these industries look like here in your country? Because they will be here. We will be making and repairing and refurbishing and remanufacturing everywhere in the world. But there's a caveat. And let me show you with a, here we are. It's wonderful what you can find down the back of the sofa. I found some hose pipe. So here's the linear degenerative economy. And Houdini are turning that circle around, saying, bring your clothing back to us, and we'll make it into a new jacket, a new ski wear. But then another company might pop up and says, well, bring your jacket back to us, and we'll turn it into a new jacket and a new textile. So I want to ask you, think of the clothing you're wearing on your back, your dress, your jacket, your shirt. Imagine that the company who made what you're wearing now says, send it back to us, and we'll make it into new clothing. I'd make a little loop above your head. Yes, really. Make a little loop above your head, imagining, that's right, we've got a circular economy emerging here. Oh, you look fantastic. But nature would laugh at us, because nature doesn't make little loops. Nature turns things into an ecosystem. Nature makes an ecosystem of textile reuse, of plastics, of metals, and we need to mimic nature's ecosystems in the way that we make our circular economy. That's why it's so crucial that we take action beyond any one company. Oh, that's gone very strange on the system. So we need to make sure that we don't do siloed circularity, the single loop, where the material flows in closed loops, it returns to brand, it's owned and protected by the company, and the technology is proprietary. I won't tell you how I made that. We need ecosystem circularity, where materials go in nested loops and they return to the ecosystem. The standards are open and shared, and the knowledge flows in the knowledge commons. We need collaboration, and of course it requires the state to work together with business to create that ecosystem. So it's a crucial role for the state together with business to create the ecosystem to make the circular economy work. So that's the regenerative story, but what about distributive design? Let me stay with companies and give you some examples of companies that I believe are putting distributive design at the heart of who they are. Employee ownership. is taking off and returning in many parts. This is John Lewis. I know we have friends from Arup in the room, an employee-owned company. In the heartlands of the Rust Belt in the US, where many industries left, the African-American community came back in, the former workers, and created their own cooperatives in those same buildings, showing that employee-owned enterprise can return the value created in business to those who helped directly create it. But of course, it goes beyond paying decent wages to those who are employees. We need companies that pay living wages throughout their supply chains, wherever those workers are. I'm fascinated by companies that are designing for affordability and distributive ownership. So, a brilliant architect in Chile and Argentina called Alejandro Aravena. He realized that many people would never be able to afford to buy a house. But he realized they could own a half house. So he started building half houses with all the water and heating and plumbing and electricity that you'd need. And you can buy that, and once you've saved up more money, you can fill the rest in. He has made housing ownership far more accessible to a very wide community who otherwise had no chance of owning their own home. And lastly, the fair tax commitment. Major companies like Lush Cosmetics are starting to sign up to say, we recognize our interdependence upon a thriving society, and we are committing to paying our fair taxes. What does that mean? It means paying the right amount of tax in the right place at the right time. And we know we need those contributions to rebuild the ecosystem of a healthy society. But here for me is the really exciting transformation that's taking place in distributive design. Because every production, whether it's my shirt or your coffee cup or the tablecloths or these speakers, everything that's produced needs energy, a production system, communications and knowledge. And in the 20th century, the technologies we used to do this were centralized by design. Think oil rig for energy, a big factory for production. Every telephone call literally went through a centralized switchboard, and knowledge was controlled in patents and copyrights. And for the first time in human history, this for me is the great opportunity. We have technologies that are asking to be distributive by design. Solar panels and wind turbines dotted across the landscapes in this village in India. And thanks to our friends at the McQuaid Institute, I actually have a solar panel in my pocket. And in 10 years' time, this will look clunky and big. This technology is phenomenal in the rate at which it's evolving. Production used to be done in a big factory. Now you can have a 3D printed building, plastics, ceramics, metals, desktop ownership of manufacturing capacity. Communication, you've all got a node of the communication network in your pockets, your phone, including this woman in a village in Tanzania. And ideas, we've got Creative Commons licensing and open source design. I think when we really get smart about putting together those 4 types of technologies, we are going to take off in terms of how we can make and produce and share and remake 21st century products. And I think it's going to be the key to regenerative and distributive design that brings us back within the living world. So let me just bring this home to companies, because I've been talking about business design and product designs. I've shared the donut diagram with so many companies over the last 5 years, and I'm fascinated by the wide range of response. On the one hand, some companies would say, well, that's very sad, but the business of business is business. And we know that's a hangover from the 1970s. But other companies say, that picture, that's like our logo. That's why we exist. We exist to sequester carbon dioxide, or to improve children's health, or to clean up that river. That's why we're in business. And I'm fascinated by what divides companies in terms of that outlook. And here I want to share with you a detective lens that I use to understand business. I think we are in the middle of a psychological transformation of what business can do and be in the world. And I'm going to say very broadly, we're moving from 20th century extractive business, which was driven by one overriding question. How much financial value can we extract from this enterprise? And you can read that in the biographies of 20th century CEOs. You hear that in the reporting from the financial markets. But when I talk to urban designers, product designers, the CEO of Houdini Sportswear or Open Motors Cars, they're asking a completely different question. And it's the same question that I hear being asked here in the Taranaki roadmap. How many different kinds of value can we generate through the way we run this enterprise, through the way we transform our region, through the way we design this city? What is it that leaves some companies asking that 20th century extractive question and others are dancing in this generative space? For me, there are 5 key design traits that I use to understand every kind of company that I encounter. And I invite you to look at any business you know of, one you love or you hate or you're curious about, through this lens. It comes from the business analyst Marjorie Kelly. The first trait, of course, is purpose. What is the purpose of this company? Here's a great example. Dong Energy, which was Danish oil and natural gas. Their purpose was to find and sell oil and gas. And then they looked at the future. They probably looked at their grandchildren and realized they needed to reinvent their purpose. And they've completely got out of fossil fuels and are now a 100% renewable energy company. In fact, they totally renamed themselves Ørsted after the man who discovered radiomagnetic technologies. That is a transformation of purpose and name to match it. How is a company governed? The principles, the rules, the practices, the culture by which business is done. We know that Unilever, famously, when Paul Pullman, he says on his day 1 of his job, he said, I'm no longer going to issue quarterly reports to shareholders. He transformed the way he was governing that company because he wanted it to pursue a generative future rather than be caught in short-term shareholder action. What about networks? How a company network with its suppliers, its customers, its community. Companies, of course, are beginning to join really transformative networks like the Renewable Energy 100 or the Circular Economy 100. But it's equally important to leave behind the old networks. These are European ones that in fossil fuels are still lobbying behind the scenes, trying to undermine European regulation. I invite you to ask yourselves here, what are the networks in this region of the world that need to be either transformed or left behind because they're pulling back business back into that extractive 20th century mode? And now let's get down to the really serious stuff. Ownership. How are companies owned? Because whether it's owned by a family, founding entrepreneurs, a community, its employees, venture capital, shareholders, all of these different ownership designs have profound impacts, of course, on how a company is financed. And too much finance in the 20th century, through stock markets and through pension funds, was pulling back in this extractive direction. As a result, I think we actually have a lot of companies today that are caught in a split mode between these two. And I'm using Unilever as an example because it's a very, very public example of something that happened. Paul Pullman, who I deeply respect, transformed Unilever's purpose to a sustainable living plan. He transformed the governance in terms of metrics, of cutting carbon, cutting water use. And he transformed the networks in which Unilever was moving, making it a very progressive company. But it was still owned by the stock market and still pulled back, therefore, by short-term financial interests. And that's why, in February 2017, Unilever was hit by an aggressive corporate takeover bid. Luckily, they fended it off. But this is a signal of that split that still exists, and we have to talk about it. Because what we ultimately have to do is bend all of those arrows in the same direction. We need new designs of business ownership and finance that actually take ownership and finance of company in the generative direction. And I'm so pleased that there's a panel discussion later on today about investing finance for the future and redesigning finance, because that will start giving us a clue of how to align finance behind the bigger vision of transformation that we have. But I want to finish with probably the most important thought of the day for me. One of the reasons why I became so deeply frustrated by economics was because if I wanted to talk about, as a student, climate change, acid rain, the destruction of coral systems, I was offered 2 words. You're talking about environmental externalities. Because when we start with the market and put that at the center of our vision, then any impact that falls outside the market contract is an externality. And I'm sorry, but this sets off alarm bells in my mind. If we are going to continue here in 2019 to talk about the death of the living world that we are bringing upon ourselves as an environmental externality, we know that last century's theories do not serve us. The philosopher Hannah Arendt once noted that a stray dog has a greater chance of surviving if given a name. And shocking though it sounds, I believe that the living world has been treated like a stray dog by economics. It's an externality on the edges. And one of the most important things that's happening today, particularly in this country, is the renaming of our relationship with the living world. Because the names matter. If I name this dog Scamp, you see him one way. If I name him Champ, you see him differently. Slight switch of the name, profound difference in who he is. And here's what I'm finding fascinating. That in the way that we are beginning as humanity from our diverse cultures to try to rename our relationship with the living world, we are actually turning to these different forms of economic relations we know, to the market, the commons, the household, and the state. The market framing has taken off. The idea that nature is not an externality, it's natural capital, and it's at the heart of New Zealand's living standards framework, and it's a strong step forward. It is, of course, still framing the living world as a market relation, and perhaps it's the adjacent possible, which we need to go to, but will then move beyond. But then there's the commons, and I see the planetary boundary science that I began with at Doughnut as putting us in the commons, recognizing our common heritage of a stable climate and fertile soils and abundant biodiversity. The household. Many indigenous peoples, including, I believe, peoples here, recognize the living world as relatives, members of a family. We are embedded in the web of life. Buen Vivir in Latin America make the same point. We are renaming the living world in our own households. And then in relation to the state, Polly Higgins, who tragically died a few weeks ago, was a pioneering lawyer trying to get recognition of the law of ecocide, illegal to kill off the living world, but also the recognition of the river of Wanganui, giving it legal personhood here 2 years ago, I see as a landmark act in giving personhood to a member of the family and protecting a commons. So thank you, Aotearoa New Zealand, for being an extraordinary pioneer to the rest of the world in how we rename our relationship to the living world. We begin now with natural capital, and I think it may help us in the next decade ahead, but profoundly, I believe, within 100 years, we will move further in that deeper relationship, all of us, and it's based from Maori values and other indigenous tribes' values that we are actually learning to rename our relationship with the living world, with humility. Let me leave you then with the only donut that may turn out to be good for us. And I thank you so much for allowing me to be part of this conversation, and I look forward to any discussion we may have now. Thank you. Hey.
Thanks, Kate. We have a few minutes for questions, and there are some on the screen there, and I'm having a look at the app as well. I want to start with this one from David, who asks, with the sense of urgency around addressing climate change, do you think political processes are agile enough to enable action to be taken in the time frame needed?
Well, there's a biggie. I think political processes that are conducted as political processes in parliaments alone will not be fast enough, no. But that's why so many citizens around the world are recognizing that politics is actually what happens between elections, and we need to get on the streets and be the citizen protester. The school strikes, the rise of Greta Thunberg and other students like her around the world. In London, I was very proud to take part in Extinction Rebellion, because we then got, after just 10 days of disruption of London, the British Parliament, for the first time in, it feels like 3 years, managed to agree on something, which is that we have a climate emergency in the UK, and are beginning to bring in place legislation. The 2050 targets that countries are setting themselves, let me be honest, I think the goal of 2050, zero carbon by 2050, I'm beginning to think it's a bit like in 1950, Roger Bannister said he wanted to run a mile in less than 4 minutes, and people said, that's impossible. It took him 4 years to run a mile in less than 4 minutes, but after he had done it, his record was broken in 46 days. And today, over 1,500 people have run a mile in less than 4 minutes. Barriers seem unbreakable until someone strolls right through them or runs right through them, and then others follow. And I think countries like yours and mine that are starting to say, let's go for net zero carbon by 2050, will actually run faster.
So what does an agile political process look like?
An agile political process, I think it's one, actually I think we heard a lot of people talking about yesterday. It's a dialogue. It builds consensus, it goes beyond consultation, it's participatory with the people of a place, because actually it's the people of a place that make transformations happen. It's not parliaments.
We're talking about capital and investment a bit later in the day. There's a question here, what will it take to remove barriers to collectives getting the capital required to move away from the top-down capitalist business models so business decisions are about the we, not the me?
We need to redesign those fundamental traits of business. And to me, and I said purpose, and it's about networks and governance, but profoundly it's about the ownership and the financing of business. And for me, this is really important because in the 20th century, many of the technologies we needed, like oil rigs and big factories, needed to bring a lot of capital together, and so you had shareholder-owned companies. But in the 21st century, we've got desktop technologies. It's meaning that companies can be much more agile and much smaller and owned by a smaller group of people. It's opening up unprecedented opportunity for employee ownership, community ownership, cooperative ownership. We need legal designs of business to keep up with the possibilities of far more distributed business than has happened in the past.
So we're trying to tell this story, we're trying to inspire people, we're trying to generate capital and investment that will allow this transition and this future to occur. Yesterday we were talking about, for example, coal mining, a very traditional business on the west coast of the South Island, the idea of convincing people and giving them a story and an idea and a hope and a vision of a different kind of life that we can move towards. I mean, there's a good question down the bottom there from someone who says, you know, tourism depends on foreign visitors. A strong option for a place like the West Coast in the South Island. That question has now just disappeared, but the question was around how do we actually transition towards something like that with the issues around air transportation, for example?
I don't know, and we don't know yet. And I look back to 1960s when Kennedy said, let's go to the moon. And we don't know how we'll get there, and we don't have the materials yet, and we don't have the technologies yet. And I think we're on that kind of journey with questions around air transportation, or let's say long-distance transportation. It needs to be reinvented. I know this session later this afternoon with talking about an electric air taxi. Maybe that's the beginning of the answer.
Someone down the bottom here asks as well, Kate, what advice would you give to the New Zealand government about dealing with the elephant in our economy, agriculture?
So we talk about net zero carbon, but actually what we should really be talking about is not being zero carbon. We need to be regenerative. All of our countries need to work within cycles of carbon. And actually there are many regenerative practices in agriculture already. People producing crops and foods of many kinds while enriching soil carbon, while capturing more carbon in the soil through new techniques. So I think there's an incredible revolution and renaissance of agricultural possibilities that's going to lie ahead of us.
Catherine's just asked, who should pay for just transition? Is it carbon-intensive corporations like oil companies who have reaped billions from exploiting our resources and people? Government will already struggle to keep up coping with climate chaos. Where do you see that burden falling?
I think companies, and I made a point about talking about paying fair taxes, because many companies that have run very extractive business models have been extremely agile and clever at optimizing their tax return, meaning paying as little as tax in as few places as little as possible. And we need to turn that around. So I think there's absolute requirement and responsibility on companies to do that. But I think a lot of just transition isn't necessarily about payment, it's about redesign. Redesigning the ownership of business, redesigning the ownership of housing and opportunities, redesigning how we create money and finance is going to be so key. So we can be very smart in how we redesign our systems so that finance is in service to humanity rather than us still being in service to finance.
I want to finish by asking, this question about fear or hope. Where do you sit on that spectrum? What is really going to motivate people to accept this transition and to be part of it, to play their role in it?
Sometimes people say to me, I love your optimism. And I say, I don't remember saying I'm optimistic. In fact, I would say, don't be optimistic if it makes you relax. It's fine, we'll figure it out, we've got technologies, we're ingenious, we'll sort it. Don't be optimistic if it makes you go there, because that won't happen. But also, don't be pessimistic if it makes you give up. and say it's too hard, we are too many, it's too late, it's too difficult.
So where do you sit on that spectrum?
So I say, don't be optimistic if it makes you relax, don't be pessimistic if it makes you give up. Be in action in all of your networks, whether it's as a CEO of a company or the newest employee, whether it's a professor of economics or a young student who dares to ask a question, whether you're a neighbor or a member of a community, or a politician or a journalist. We all have extraordinary roles of influence through our networks that other people can't reach. Be in action in your own life and think, how can I be part of the transformation that I already know I want to be part of?
We're about to talk about policy change and the significant conversations that have been had this week, not just here but around the country, on these issues. What is your sense as someone coming to our country of how New Zealand is perceived and seen on these issues?
Honestly, we are looking to you. Sitting very far away in little Europe, we are looking to New Zealand for the well-being budget, for the living standards framework, for giving personhood to a river. I mean, that's why I came, because there's something happening here that seems to be cutting free of the old framing, and it's so clearly drawing on the wealth of the Maori values that are being reincorporated into a new way of thinking. You are pioneers, no pressure, guys, but you're pioneers that we are looking to and saying, wow, it's a bit like the 4-minute mile. You're breaking through that barrier and talking about well-being, not just endless GDP growth, and actually reinventing a relationship with the living world. So yes, keep going for your own sake, for Taranaki, for the whole nation, but you are inspiring something that's going to have ripples much, much, much further than here.
Kate, thanks so much for your time.
Thank you very much.
Cheers.